we talk about a man for all seasons. He was a nationalist, an intellectual, a journalist, a lawyer, a poet, a writer, and of course, a diplomat. All of them packed into one. That man was KM Pannikar, a man who's worn so many hats during the course of his life. For many, he was just a name who found a fleeting mention in our history books. In common discourse, many remember him famously or infamously as the man who misled Jawaharlal Nehru on China's invasion of Tibet. But very little is known about the man himself. We know very little about KM Pannikar. Who was he? Where did he come from? His background, early writings, and his beliefs. And more importantly, what was his contribution in shaping post colonial India? A new book sheds light on that aspect. It's called A Man for All Seasons, The Life of KM Pannikar. It's written by historian Narayani Basu and published by Context, which is an imprint of Westland books. Now, this book is lengthy yet extremely lucid or simple in its language. The book also manages to cover so many facets of this absolutely fascinating individual who hasn't been talked about as much. Ms. Basu was kind enough to send us a copy of this book in advance, and today we got a chance to speak to her. We delve into KM Pannikar's early writings, some of his avatars, and his equation with Gandhi and, of course, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. Hello and welcome, I'm Shubham Chauhan. Let's get started.
This is somebody who was very present for so many of modern India's seasons that honestly, which is why I've titled it A Man for All Seasons, because he genuinely was present for so many of modern India's seasons. That's why I chose to write about KM Pannikar, because the more I researched about him and the more I read about him, the more fascinated I became. And he's changed the terminology, right? Because with Pannikar, what you see is a constant evolution. You see a constant sort of progression of his thought depending on the times he was living in, depending on the circumstances and contexts in which he was problematic for me. Is when you are using it as a diplomat in a post-colonial world, in a world dominated by Cold War, in a world where India is looking to present itself on the global stage as a stable, cohesive entity, looking to lead a so-called third world, looking to present itself as a leader among the Asian countries, as an emissary for peace among ongoing global conflict. Phrases like Greater India or Further India in such a context becomes chauvinistic, it becomes narrow-minded. It leads to the risk of erasure of certain communities and people who may have been marginalized during the presence of the empire and may still be marginalized as well. You also have a prime minister who seems to be ignoring the fact that both Sardar Patel as well as Panikar's colleagues in the Ministry of External Affairs, Girija Shankar Bajpai, KPS Menon, they're all telling Nehru, look, you have to be cautious as far as the communists are concerned. You cannot be swept away by this rhetoric. You can't listen to everything Panikar is telling you, right? Yeah. And it's a measure of how much Nehru trusts Panikar and believes in Panikar. Decades of history on the shoulders of one man is definitely unfair. I think the stakeholders here were too many, and the factors at play also were too many for the blame to be pinned on one man alone. I don't think that's fair. I think everyone here had a stake and a role to play in where we are with China. So, first of all, Shubham, thank you so much for having me on the show. Look, I came across KM Pannikar first in the capacity of when I was working as a policy analyst. I came across him in the role of an ambassador, our most contentious and controversial ambassador to China, to Nationalist China and the People's Republic of China. And then when I was researching my book on VP Menon, I encountered him in a totally different sphere, which is in the Chamber of Princes, where he was from the 1930s to the 1940s. And he was an incredibly influential character in the Chamber of Princes as well. And I was very intrigued at that point because I didn't know of this part of his career. So I went down a sort of research rabbit hole, if you will, and I began digging about in the archives to find out what I could. And I discovered that this was a man who, from 1915 to 1963, has been part of modern India's story almost every step of the way, right? I mean, just to give you an overall bird's eye view of what this man accomplished and was in his lifetime, he was a nationalist. He dabbled in anarchism sometime in the mid 1920s. He was a historian. He was a journalist. He was a lawyer. He was a foreign policy mandarin. He was an administrator, a diplomat, a writer of fiction, and a poet, right? So this is somebody whose career and whose life can barely be compressed into one volume, though I've done my best to do so. Um, and it also doesn't sum up who this person was, because he was so much more than just his job profiles as well, which is something that I began to discover as I began putting together what I discovered in the archives into one single narrative. Um, and this is somebody who worked with and walked with the legends of modern Indian history, from Jawaharlal Nehru to Mahatma Gandhi to Chou Enlai to Mao Zedong to Jamal Abdel Nasser. Everywhere you look, this man has been present. He was represented us when we were a decolonized nation in a world that was dominated by the Cold War. He was a very ardent advocate for federalism. Um, he was the architect of independent India's maritime policy. He was the head of the States Reorganization Commission. And even more than that, his writings, and he starts writing when he's a first year student in Oxford, in 1915. And he writes across subjects from citizenship to immigration to nationalism to history to geopolitics and foreign policy. And this is entirely apart from his body of fiction, which my book doesn't go into simply to preserve the sanity of anyone who's reading it. But this is somebody who's was very present for so many of modern India's seasons that honestly, I mean, which is why I've titled it A Man for All Seasons, because he genuinely was present for so many of modern India's seasons. That's why I chose to write about K.M. Panikar, because the more I researched about him and the more I read about him, the more fascinated I became. I think the First World War was a crucial point for many Indians across the colony and across the empire. For K.M. Panikar, it's a process of, as I've written up, this constant unlearning and relearning of what he already knew. So he comes to Oxford as this young man who really doesn't know much about the issues with which young men in Oxford are concerned. So they're concerned, he arrives in England on the cusp of the First World War. The First World War is not broken out yet. But war clouds are very much in the air. So is home rule, so is universal adult franchise, so is the suffragette movement. Labor unrest is rife across England at this point. These are all subjects that young men at Oxford, young men and women at Oxford are engaging with. And these are issues with which Panikar first finds himself considerably out of his depth. And he goes back to his brother and he says, "Look, I don't know enough about this. I think I'm going to have to read up more in order to be somewhat at par with these guys who are going to be my colleagues in college." And this is the first way in which he starts a process of wanting to know more. It's a pattern that he will stick to all his life. Whenever he felt out of his depth, whenever he felt that he didn't know enough about a subject, he would always go back to read about it much more. And this is something that stayed with him all through his life, no matter how advanced in his career he was. At campus, it becomes very difficult to avoid being involved in the political and overall geopolitical atmosphere also, because once the world is at war and once he starts having these conversations with very politically aware young men on campus, he becomes aware of the fact that he needs to add his voice to all of these voices as well. So he begins writing on citizenship, on immigration. And his early works, you can see this sort of sense of rage, because he's still a young man and he's very angry at, the empire's inequality, the racism. the fact that we are subjects rather than citizens in our own country. And it's the first time that you see KM Panikar beginning to engage with concepts like these, with trying to understand what it means to be an Indian, particularly in a world that is currently dominated by empire and war. uh, where does that take you as an Indian? Where will that leave you once the war is over? What does that mean for India? What does that mean for the ongoing national movement? What does that mean for each Indian, not just within India, but in colonies across the empire, right? And, and you see all of his years at Oxford being dominated by him constantly keeping up a stream of writing on subjects like these. There's not one single subject that concerns India that he leaves untouched. And some of these are very raw because he's still beginning to write on these subjects. He's still beginning to think about these subjects. So many of these, for instance, nationalism, continues to evolve over time and as he grows up and as he grows older and as he sees more of the world and more of the national movement. But I think the First World War and his years in Oxford were incredibly formative in order to begin a process of learning what it means to be an Indian and how he wanted to contribute to that quest of being an Indian in an eventually free country. I think, when you're writing about something like this in 2025, um, the lens of hindsight and retrospect by now is so a advanced and b binary that it's difficult to look at a time which was ideologically fluid and politically fluid. It also becomes difficult to sort of remember that there was such a thing as being a traditionalist when it came to being a nationalist, right? You could be a good Hindu without being Hindutva, right? Um, when K.M. Panikar was writing these early writings of his, which were grounded, and his writings on nationalism remained grounded in Hinduism right through, right? This does not change for him. His writings on nationalism, history remain grounded in a sense of the fact that Indian identity was primarily Hindu. And India's culture, its ethos was immensely centered around a Hindu civilizational ethos. Um, when he's making these early writings during the time of the First World War, it was also being made during the time of a predominant school of thought, which was the Greater India School of Thought. And the Greater India School of Thought at that point was this trans-imperial, very Indo-centric, very Hindu revivalist school of thought, which was being articulated not just by young men like Panikar, but many other much older, seasoned nationalists as a response to colonialism, as a response to the presence of empire, and in some, like in very brief terms, this was essentially basically telling the colonial powers that look, we have been here for millennia before you. Ours has been an empire, a cultural empire in that sense of the word. We have spread our spiritual and cultural influence across regions like Southeast Asia, Central Asia. um, for Panikkar, this was never a muscular, militarized, territorial sense of Greater India. It was not an Akhand Bharat, should I say. And in that sense, because a Greater India school of thought, when you look back at it, yes, it can be used to propagate a militant form of Hinduism, but it could also be, as it was then, being used by people like Panikkar to propagate an idea of cultural continuity as far as India was concerned. Because, like I said, this was tied to a constant quest for Indian identity. The Greater India school of thought in the early 20th century seemed to be, for these guys, a good and adequate response to colonialism. Right? Where it becomes problematic is in a post colonial world. Right? When Panikar is writing um, based on, and he's changed the terminology, right? Because with Panikar, what you see is a constant evolution. You see a constant sort of progression of his thought depending on the times he was living in, depending on the circumstances and contexts in which he was living. So he changes the use of the word Greater India and it becomes Further India later on, right? It's essentially the same thing, he just changes the terminology. Where it becomes problematic for me is when you are using it as a diplomat in a post colonial world, in a world dominated by Cold War, in a world where India is looking to present itself on the global stage as a stable, cohesive entity, um, looking to lead a so-called third world, looking to present itself as a leader among the Asian countries, as an emissary for peace among ongoing global conflicts. That is when it becomes problematic because using phrases like Greater India or Further India in such a context becomes chauvinistic, it becomes narrow minded. It leads to the risk of erasure of certain communities and people who may have been marginalized during the presence of the empire and may still be marginalized as well. So it becomes problematic, when times change and when transfer power happens, and India is emerged as a free nation. When he's older, also, and this is towards the end of his life, and his writing has become considerably rigid in the sense that he is leaning very heavily on Hinduism being the crux around which India must unite. It's writing that seriously discomforts somebody like a Jawaharlal Nehru, because as the prime minister of this country, he was very uncomfortable with the fact that here was a leading diplomat and a public intellectual making these arguments. And Nehru's questioned by this often sometimes on the international stage. And, Panikar is referred to and Nehru is asked what he thinks. And Nehru is very clear about the fact that, look, people have different opinions. We may not necessarily share those opinions. Right? So you see a constant arc of evolution, which never goes into Hindutva supremacist territory, right? It becomes, I'd say, problematic, I'd say chauvinist, I'd definitely say insular, especially in a world that has changed considerably since the early years of the 20th century. But it is never going as far as V.D. Savarkar or K.M. Munshi. So Panikar comes to journalism when he is very frustrated with being an academic. So before this, he's been, head of the history department at Aligarh Muslim University, and he has always thought that an academic life would be suitable for him. It's when he comes back to India from Oxford and he actively looks at what's happening at the country, right? So he's joined Aligarh, and the reason I'm talking about Aligarh is because there's great context for that before he joins journalism. It's the reason why he joins journalism also, because he joins Aligarh when the country has been through Jallianwala Bagh, the non-cooperation movement, the rise of the Khilafat movement, the horrors of Chori Chora. These are all times that he has lived through while he has been at Aligarh. And he has now come to the conclusion that the life of an academic, however idyllic it might have been in his mind, was not enough right now. He wanted to be an active contributor to the national movement, and it's around this time that you hear him saying, politics is the life that I want. And in those days, journalism was a sort of stepping stone to being in active politics. It was one of the ways in which you could wield your pen and wield your voice at the same time, and you could actively speak up for causes that you felt needed to be spoken up for. So he joins Swarajya first. It's a very small crowd-funded newspaper in Madras. It's one of his first stints in journalism, and he joins as deputy editor. And it's very rapidly that you see a very different side of KM Panikar emerging. This very young, angry journalist who wants to speak up on issues of truth and issues of taking on corruption and taking on possible political machinations. Also, now this is not the job that his editor T. Prakasam has hired him for. Panikkar is very actively involved in lots of local politics at this point. There's a whole non-Brahmin movement starting in politics in Madras. There is also the temple entry movement happening in Travancore, which Panikkar, actively wants to aid and actively wants to ensure that that movement gets interest from the national party of the Congress right now. All of this is not something that he was hired to do, but it's something that he's using his position as a Swarajya to try and ensure. Eventually, he's asked to leave, and he's very disillusioned by this. It takes him a while before he joins the Hindustan Times, and he joins the Hindustan Times after having been Gandhi's emissary in Amritsar, where he's incredibly important in resolving the ongoing Akali issue in Punjab.
Yes, yes.
And both of these experiences, both with the Swarajya and being Gandhi's emissary in Amritsar, has given him the idea that, um, the Congress as a national party cannot afford to be ambiguous as far as the princely states are concerned. Uh, at some point, and for Panikkar, that point is coming very soon, the Congress will have to take a stand as far as the princely states are concerned, right? So when he's finishing his job as Gandhi's emissary in Amritsar, he is now stuck at a loose end because he doesn't know where to go from here. Uh, Jawaharlal Nehru at this point offers him the job of writing a collection of essays of the history of the non-cooperation movement, because for Nehru at this point, um, and in fact at all points for Nehru's political career, he's been looking at a larger public relations image for India, representing India's national struggle to the wider world. And in Panikkar, he sees, the kind of pen that he feels will accomplish that goal. That's not what Panikkar wants at all. Panikkar wants to be where power is. He wants to be able to make a difference. He's a very ambitious young man, and he doesn't want to be relegated to being a kind of Congress PR spokesman. Um, from this stems the first discussions of what will become the Hindustan Times, right? And it's a remarkable period because you see Nehru constantly writing to Panikkar, who is heading what was called the Sahayak Bureau in Amritsar, which is essentially the Congress PR office at that point, constantly asking him for updates and asking, he's heard
Yes.
rumors of Panikkar wanting to start a newspaper like this and saying, okay, look, is this true? And Panikkar just doesn't reply, and it's a remarkable thing to not reply to Jawaharlal Nehru. It's not something that you hear of anyone doing. But Panikkar is he's very determined that this is something that he wants to do. So he's hashing out the details of what will become the Hindustan Times with Lal Puri and Mangal Singh in Amritsar. Um, these guys basically want to ensure that awareness of the Akali cause and also of Sikh heritage and history is widespread. They want an English daily to establish the same goals. Panikkar says, look, you can't establish an English daily in a center like Amritsar. If you need to establish a newspaper, it will have to be in a city like Delhi. It will have to be with far greater distribution. That is the only way you will achieve your goals. Um, so he comes to Delhi. And there's this whole tussle also about funding, right? And it's sort of amusing because you have this figure of 1 lakh being arrived at, and all these three men thought, okay, 1 lakh rupees will be enough to run a newspaper, to found and run a newspaper. And they couldn't even manage 1 lakh. It was eventually 25,000 rupees, which they managed to scrape together from the diaspora. So he comes to
Right.
Delhi. He's at this point committed to the cause of what he has put himself behind. He comes to Delhi, begins looking for a building, which he eventually finds on Burn Bastion Road. He equips it with two presses, and this is a man who doesn't know anything about setting up a newspaper, right? So it also speaks uh, to the fact that not only was he ambitious, but once he was committed to something, he really didn't pull back. He didn't
Right.
have capital apart from the 25,000 that they had managed to gather and some of his own savings. He was already quite broke at this point. Um, he just went ahead with it. And he equips this building with, it's a 3-story building on Burn Bastion Road. He equips it with a Dawson stop hand-fed stop cylinder press and a meal press, which are the only two makes that are available in Delhi at the time. And one floor has those two presses. The other are the editorial floors, which are very Spartan. And he asks Gandhi to come and inaugurate what will become, the Hindustan Times. By this point, he's brought in a couple of friends as editors. He's hashed out the fact that, okay, this is going to be an evening paper. This is going to be 12 pages. The price point is going to be 6 paise. He asks Gandhi to come and inaugurate it. Uh, this is the last thing that Gandhi wants to do because it is the September of 1954 and there is widespread communal rioting across North India. The last thing Gandhi wants to be seen doing is inaugurating a newspaper. But Panikkar has done sterling work as Gandhi's emissary in Amritsar. He's committed to inaugurating this paper, so he arrives and he gives a little speech in which he says, look, the cause of this newspaper will be that you don't suppress facts and you don't publish false truths. Um, and in a sort of very prescient omen, the first edition is delayed because the printing presses break down. So it's a week before the actual first edition rolls out. And right from the get go, you see Panikkar bringing to the fore his formidable network of contacts. Right, the first few pages often have messages from people like Sarojini Naidu, Muhammad Ali, Rabindranath Tagore, all of so you're instantly establishing the Hindustan Times as this mouthpiece of nationalism. You're automatically saying that okay, this is what the paper is going to speak for, without being partisan in any way. It is just going to speak for the cause of Indian nationalism. Um, so the kind of editorials that Panikkar is publishing right now speak very highly to what he is standing for also. It's the kind of journalism that he feels he's wanted to do for a while. So, and for a while he has his head, right? Like he's publishing editorials largely pushing for unity. He's saying that India cannot pull together unless, you remove religious and political fissures. There must be communal harmony in order for India to unite to push back against the empire. The Congress must take note of the princely states in order to make it a thoroughly nationalistic push. He's also taking on corrupt state governments. He's taking on, viceroys. He's completely unafraid, right? He's also not afraid of publishing his, the kind of stories that people do enjoy reading, gossipy stories and delicious
Yes.
scandal stories. So he does a bit of both with a great stress on nationalism and unity until eventually things begin sort of sliding out of his hand because there's a more right-wing agenda that's beginning to be played out. This paper shifts into the hands of people like Madan Mohan Malviya and Lala Lajpat Rai. There's a newer, younger board of directors on which G.D. Birla is sitting.
Yes.
That eventually ensures that Panikkar leaves the Hindustan Times. Now, what he's learned at the Hindustan Times is apart from the structural nitty gritties of running a newspaper, founding it, what it means to administratively run a newspaper, he's also learned the many ways in which propaganda can be used to shape a political movement or political opinion and indeed public discourse. He has learned how stories for the truth should be told and can be told, and he's also learned rather bitterly that journalism is not for him, right? So it's
Yes.
also it's a moment of great professional learning, sure, but it's also a moment of real personal disillusionment for him because for him Hindustan Times has been also a vehicle from which he can publish his own views on nationalism and patriotism, which he felt needed to be said at this point. So, very briefly, Panikkar comes to the question of Amritsar after he leaves Swarajya. He's again very disillusioned, and you see this disillusionment at various points in his
Yes.
career, right? Especially his early career as he's trying to settle down and find some kind of niche for himself. So when he comes to Bombay post Swarajya, he is very disillusioned. He's got a wife and children by this point. He needs to find a way to support them and a way to continue trying to fulfill his own personal ambitions. So he comes to Bombay. He meets an old friend, C.F. Andrews, who is a missionary and who is very close to Gandhi, and who knows Gandhi is now currently looking for somebody who will be on the ground for him in Amritsar. So Gandhi, this is now 1924. Gandhi has been released from jail after, he had been imprisoned after Chori Chora for sedition. Is released in 24, years ahead of schedule due to ill health, and he is looking for a cause behind which the Congress can sort of gather and put itself. He's chosen to support the Akali movement in Amritsar, but because he's still ill and frail, he needs somebody on the ground there. Um, so he meets with Panikar and he says, "Look, this is your brief. Are you up for it?" And Panikkar says yes immediately, because it's the first time. It's not the first time he's encountered Gandhi, right? Like, he's encountered Gandhi before at Aligarh during the non-cooperation movement, when Gandhi has come to Aligarh, has asked Panikkar to join the non-cooperation movement, and at the time Panikkar said, "No, I want to stay here in Aligarh. I still have work to do here, and my loyalties are here for now." But this is the second time, and now it's a more direct opportunity that's been handed to him. If he actively ends up pleasing Gandhi, uh, it could be a make or break moment for him. So he agrees to go to Amritsar. Now, very briefly speaking, what is happening in Amritsar is essentially uh, the issue of the gurudwaras, which have been under the control of very corrupt priests or mahants. So the struggle is to get the gurudwaras free of the control of these corrupt priests. So, which is why you have, the Akali movement forming in order to ensure that that happens. In the middle of this are two princes, the Prince of Nabha and the Maharaja of Patiala. Nabha is very pro Akali, and the Akalis are pro Nabha. Patiala is pro the British government, and so there's a standoff in the state, which is often resulting in violent clashes. Now, I'm putting this very simplistically just for the interest of time, but Panikar's mission here is uh, to ensure that the Congress presence in the state is shored up by means of the Sahayak Bureau, which is essentially, like I said, a public relations office where he will be keeping an eye on the ground and reporting back to both Gandhi and Nehru about what the situation is, how the Congress can help to sort of detangle this standoff, and also put down roots in a state where it has been regionally weak so far. Now, the machinations of this are very lengthy, and honestly,
Yes.
it's laid out. It's laid out in the book, but he does manage to pull it off, and he does two things here. Apart from successfully resolving the Kali movement problems, what he does is also to draw Gandhi's attention to the temple entry movement in Travancore, and tell him that, okay, apart from this, this is another movement that the Congress can get behind. Now, the Congress has been very ambiguous and non committal about this thus far, because for them, uh, being involved in the princely states is akin to letting the local rulers know that we have stepped in to usurp your power, and they have no desire to antagonize local rulers just yet, because they feel that whatever is happening in the princely states right now is the business of the local rulers. But with the success of the resolution of the Akali problem, uh, Panikkar feels it is the right time to also remind Gandhi that the temple entry movement is still ongoing in Travancore and could use support. So you see the sort of beginnings of Panikkar as a diplomat here, because he is now dealing, and this is a Malayali man who doesn't speak any Hindustani. He's the odds are heavily against him in a state like Amritsar. But he goes in, he resolves it, he resolves the issue to the satisfaction of both Gandhi and Nehru. And his dispatches to both establish a connection between himself and these two men. And it's his connection with Nehru that gets established now. And his dispatches to Nehru, and Nehru gives him complete carte blanche. He says, you send back the reports as and when you see fit, but they must be regular reports. And it begins this process of uh, Panikkar rising to Nehru's notice around this time, which is something that doesn't change until both men die. And it is also at this point that Panikkar begins wanting more for himself, like I said. And it's also at this point that he goes to the length of not replying to Nehru when
Yeah.
Nehru is asked what's happening on the ground. And to Nehru's credit, it's this moment that earns Panikkar the respect of Jawaharlal Nehru, because Nehru recognizes that, okay, this is somebody who is clearly taking a stand for himself, and he
Yeah.
might not like the methods that are being employed, but it does take a certain kind of chutzpah to do it.
Yeah.
And I think from this point onwards, that relationship is established between Nehru and Panikkar, and it's a relationship that withstands the arc of the independence movement and beyond. Look, there are several factors here, okay, because when Panikkar is sent to China, um, we don't have a trained Indian foreign service. We don't have trained
Mm.
career diplomats. At this point, the kind of men and women who are being sent abroad are people who Nehru feels he can trust. Right now, this relationship that he's had with Panikkar has been also a very intellectual one, right? So he's been watching Panikkar uh, evolving and Panikkar's mind evolving since the 1920s, right? So by the time Panikkar is sent, it is 1948. India has just attained freedom. Um, Panikkar, meanwhile, has also written several very influential tracts on post-colonial Indian foreign policy, which are incredibly
Mm.
prescient, right? So he's pushed for a maritime policy. He has articulated federalism very cogently. These are all things that Nehru has looked at and has found to be of interest. He also importantly shares this vision with Nehru of Asian solidarity. And this is something that he has been uh, propounding since the 1920s, where he basically says that, look, any decolonized world is nothing without Asia or Africa. In Asia specifically, India and China have this very immensely deep shared civilizational history and ethos, which both can build and move and grow together. And in a sense, it's a very Nehruvian vision also. So that's why he's sent, and it's one of the many reasons why he's chosen to be sent to nationalist China. Nationalist China at this point in 1948 is in a mess, right? The civil war is at its peak. We don't know which way it's going to go. Once we realize that the communists are going to seize power, we need to figure out a policy of how to deal with them. We also need to figure out how long it's going to take the communists to sort of settle down and sort of take control, so to speak, administratively and geopolitically. Panikkar's reputation has suffered immensely also because of um, mistakes that he definitely made, right? So you have this sort of very paradoxical trajectory emerging from his time in China. So, for instance, when he is in nationalist China in 48, he sends this very prescient memo back to New Delhi called China Goes Communist, where he says that,
Mm.
look, once the communists take over, there is every likelihood that they are going to follow a trajectory that Chiang Kai shek and the nationalists were following already, which is territorial consolidation, where they feel that they have historical precedence. And they are going to look to make good on all the dynasties that have gone before, the Hans, the Manchus, what have you. Um, so you have flashes of prescience coming from Panikkar. You also have decidedly shaky reportage coming from Panikkar, right? You
Yeah.
also have a New Delhi that doesn't know where it stands so far. For one, they don't seem to estimate correctly the fact that communist China is actually has most of its ducks in a row, right? Like it's going to take over, it is going to follow what Panikkar had been warning that it would do. Um, but India is also in a stage of, it's entered the stage of Cold War, it's entered the stage of decolonization. The United States is in the picture. There are several other considerations happening at this point. You also have a very ambiguous policy towards Tibet, right? You also have a prime minister who seems to be ignoring the fact that both Sardar Patel as well as Panikar's colleagues in the Ministry of External Affairs, Girija Shankar Bajpai, KPS Menon, they're all telling Nehru, look, you have to be cautious as far as the communists are concerned. You cannot be swept away by this rhetoric. You can't listen to everything Panikkar is telling you, right?
Yeah.
And it's a measure of how much Nehru trusts Panikkar and believes in Panikkar and believes also in his own idealistic visions of Asian solidarity that Panikkar is sent back to represent India with the
Mm.
establishment of the People's Republic of China. Right now, it's in the People's Republic of China that you see some truly strange reportage coming in from Panikkar, where he, is almost lyrical in his descriptions of the communist leaders. He describes Chou en Lai's fingers as being like tender green onion shoots, and
Yeah.
he describes Mao as being like this new age Moses who is leading his people to freedom.
Mm.
There is also no doubt that his reportage, as far as China has been concerned, has also given him a sort of first look in as far as the Chinese top leadership is concerned. So he gets meetings ahead of every other country that is in China at this point. There is natural resentment also on the ground against Panikkar. It's also at this point that he begins to be decidedly shaky as far as our borders are concerned. There are discussions which lie in which Panikkar does not mention the border. And it's very strange that he leaves out a question of a border settlement in any kind of negotiations with China. He leaves, and again, this is something that colleagues in the Ministry of External Affairs are literally shouting about by this point, saying this is very strange. Why has a border settlement been left out of overall negotiations? And Panikar's answer to this is okay, but they should know. I mean, there are maps to go on, and Nehru has talked about it enough in Parliament. So, the assumption is that they know. Now, an Indian ambassador cannot assume, right?
Yes.
You need to protect your own country's interests, and that omission cast a very long and dark shadow not only on his public career but on bilateral relations as well. And this is to say nothing about Tibet and the Chinese invasion of Tibet as well, where his
Yes.
reportage again was extremely shaky. Um, and you see China keeps cropping up in the latter half of the book because that is the latter half of his career,
Yes.
which is deeply affected by what happens in China. And yet, curiously, Nehru appoints him yet again to very important positions even afterwards, right? So he's Nehru's
Mm.
man in Cairo, he's Nehru's man in France. He comes back after Egypt to head the States Reorganization Commission too. So it's almost as though Nehru does not give up on people that he has supported, right? So as far as specifically China is concerned, I think the holistic picture when you zoom out and when you look at the chronology of events, and again I've given a very bird's eye view of what was actually happening on the ground because it's a very intricate web of dates and events. And honestly, if you look at it in a sort of bird's eye view, what is happening is a mix of things. You have an ambassador
Mm.
on the ground giving decidedly shaky reportage. You also have a prime minister who is taking that reportage on board, who is telling Panikkar, okay, don't worry, you're getting a lot of criticism, don't listen to it. But is speaking to the Americans and saying, yes, Panikkar is gullible and can be easily swayed by what he hears. So you also have a prime minister who's hedging his bets as far as the role of the United States is concerned, right?
Yes.
So you have a lot of factors and a lot of stakeholders here. I think putting the blame of decades of history on the shoulders of one man is definitely unfair. I think the stakeholders here were too many, and the factors at play also were too many for the blame to be pinned on one man alone. I don't think that's fair. I think everyone here had a stake and a role to play in where we are with China. I think writing this book was really a great reminder of the fact that, when you look at the history of the independence movement and the first few years of our existence as a post colonial nation, we tend to dismiss it as certain movements or moments that we read of in history textbooks. And while all of those movements and moments are vitally important, you sometimes forget the whole sweep of people and the decisions that they take and the causes that they support and the opinions they have, as well as the entire international context within which the national movement was operating, within which we began to sort of think of things like a foreign policy, think of things like a constitution. What are we going to look like after the after an eventual transfer of power? What is a possible constitution going to look like? What are we going to do with the princely states? Right. So when we talk of the transfer of power and independence, I think we tend to look at it as this ongoing revolution almost, and sure, it was an ongoing revolution, but there were so many moments behind the scenes that were pulling together to create the republic that we are in today, and that was actually created in 1950. In fact, forget 1947. Um, I think we tend to forget it. I think K.M. Panikar's life, because of the length and breadth of that life, and because of the causes with which he was involved, whether it was, founding editor of the Hindustan Times, whether it was with the princely states, whether it was as our ambassador in several key posts around the world, or the States Reorganization Commission, which again reorganized our country according to language. I think we tend to forget that the idea of India was one that was in constant motion and in constant evolution. And there were many people behind the scenes, not just the faces and names that we grow up studying in history textbooks. There are many faces and names behind the scenes sometimes who are helping that vision come together.